Hello everyone, my name is Kazuto, former director of American and Canadian Institute at Sophia University. I teach North American Area Studies here. On behalf of current director, Professor Noriko Ishii, I'd like to welcome 4 scholars today. First, Dr. Bettina-blum. Her research was entitled British Forces in Germany, the Occupation of the Stationing of Troops in Transnational Perspective. This is her book. Second, Dr. Christine de Matos, Associate Dean Research, Faculty of Arts, Sciences and Business and Law, Senior Lecturer at the University of Notre. She authored numerous books, including Imposing Peace and Prosperity, Australia, Social Justice and Labor Reform in Occupied Japan in 2008, and Japan as an Occupier and then Occupied in 2015 with Mark Caprio. Third, Dr. Rowena Ward, Senior Lecturer at the University of Wollongong Australia. She authored books including Gender, Power and Military Occupations, Asia Pacific and Middle East since 1945 in 2020 with Christine de Matos. Last but not least, Dr. Mark Caprio, Professor Emeritus at Rikkyo University. He authored numerous books including East Asian Voices in 2015 with John Sager and others. We will have about 40-45 minutes roundtable informal discussion about the workshop. With that introduction, I'd like to ask Bettina to introduce our project.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank DFG, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, for funding the workshop. It was originally meant to take place in November 2020, but due to COVID-19, the workshop had to be postponed, and we are very happy that it could finally take place now. The aim of the workshop is to discuss and prepare a bigger joint project on a comparison of the Allied occupations in Japan and Germany after World War II. While there are many studies on Allied policies in Germany and Japan and on sexual relationships between Allied soldiers and local women, we know still little about relations in normal everyday life. Therefore, we especially focus on daily interactions between occupiers and occupied. We ask, for example, where members of the occupation forces lived and how these spaces were created. When and how occupiers and occupied met and how they perceived and communicated with each other. How both sides experienced the power relationship and their own agency, and how far the occupation and the occupation spaces are remembered in Germany and Japan.
Thanks for that. The occupations of Japan and Germany are often considered in terms of maybe the way the depictions of them have been carried out in popular culture, etc. But there are lots of similarities, and if we look at the political structures of those occupations, we can see a very big similarity. In Japan, although it is often seen as an American occupation, it was an Allied occupation, and that Allied grouping was the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces with their own area of responsibilities. So most of the country was under the control of the American forces, but there was the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces in Chugoku area and southern Honshu, or western Honshu, as well as Shikoku Island. So we actually have the similarity with Germany, which of course was broken down into 4 zones of responsibility. And so we had what of course then became the East Germany under Russia. We had the Americans, the British, and then also the French. So there's actually this political structure that is actually very similar. But what we're actually looking at is what goes on as a comparative level below that, the people. And although those political structures actually impact on how people interact, etc., we're actually looking at it at that level of the people and the person-to-person relationships. And they come in all different arenas. at the political organisational level, as well as at the level of the occupiers. But just before we go on and hand it over, I just want to actually, just to think about for a moment what British Commonwealth occupation means in terms of the fact that it is actually made up of the British, the Australians, the New Zealanders, as well as what was then British India. So we actually have this really interesting structural thing within BCOF of a variety of different organisations and governments and their responsibilities. And we also have, in case of British India, of course, the colonisers being colonised themselves. And of course, over time, we see a change in the organisation of the occupation, but also in terms of the organisation of the political structures back home in those countries. And I have to hand it over now to Dr. Matos to discuss some of the themes.
Thank you, Rowena. Yeah, so when we think of these, both of these occupations, certainly as Rowena has described, these political structures, we think of perhaps military occupations very much in military terms, as military forces coming to occupy a country. And this, of course, is certainly the case. But the people often forgotten in that story are the civilians who also come as part of those occupation forces. And they might come as missionaries, they might come as white-collar workers to work in the civilian political space. They could be members of the YWCA come to support the military forces and provide amenities for them. But of particular interest, I think, for this project are the families who came to join, both those who are members of the military forces and those who are members of the more civilian level of occupation authority. And this occurred in both Germany and Japan. So these were the known as the dependents in the American zones in each case, and the married families in the British zone in occupied Germany. And these families of the forces began to arrive, especially from 1946 onwards. By 1949, in the German occupied zones, we see about 30,000 of these families in the American zone and about 24,000 members of these families in the British zone. In occupied Japan, there were tens of thousands of these dependents who came as part of the American presence in occupied Japan. And they were also part of the British Commonwealth occupation area in smaller numbers perhaps than the Americans, but still there nonetheless in places like Kure and Etojima and Iwakuni. And so they played a pretty important role, a role that's probably quite forgotten in narratives about the occupation today. And while many of these families went home at the end of these occupations, some of course stayed on in both Germany and Japan to become the military families with the ongoing military bases that were established in the Cold War era. And of course, this occurred up until very recently in the cases of places like Okinawa are ongoing. So there's also a connection, I suppose an ongoing post-war connection from these military families that arrived during occupation to the post-war period. And so when we talk about the relationships between occupier and occupied, these kind of more civilian relationships are something very, very important to our research. But of course, where did all these families live when they arrived? They needed spaces to live in. So perhaps this is one of the first themes we could pursue about the housing and the housing complexes that were constructed or requisitioned in each of these occupations. So, yeah, Kaz, I'll hand it over to you to talk perhaps the Japan situation.
All righty. I'm dealing with the U.S. houses built between 1946 and 49. They were ordered to build by the GHQ SCAP. The total number required was 20,000, but right after World War II, There was not much material available. Human resources are available, but materials are not available. So therefore, they ended up requisitions the old building, Western style building, and built the new houses, such as Grand Heights in Rowena Ward, Washington Heights in Harajuku, and they're all gone. They're completely destroyed and forgotten. But those are the houses that housed the families of the military personnel, and that has been forgotten memories, but the legacies is still living in Japan too. So those are the housing situation first witnessed in post-World War II.
Yeah. Would you like to talk about Germany, Bettina, the housing in
Housing
Germany?
situation in Germany.
Yes, it was different from the situation in Japan, as in Germany there were houses which met the standards of the British forces or also the other Allied forces. So they requisitioned big houses, nice houses. They had certain standards, how many bathrooms, or living room or bedrooms officers and soldiers needed. And so they requisitioned houses according to these standards. This meant that they chose houses which met the standards, and the German inhabitants had to move out. The German local administration was responsible in finding new accommodation for them. This was sometimes the family could move to other family members in a house elsewhere, so it wasn't such a big problem, but in many cases it was a huge problem to find houses for thousands of Germans in these badly destroyed cities. So many German families experienced harsh living conditions or had to live in really difficult conditions, sometimes for many years. Some British families allowed German owners or individual members of the families to stay there if there was an attic and they didn't need the attic, or a smaller house in the garden, then sometimes the German family was allowed to live there. But this was an individual agreement. There was no right to live there. So if the family moved out, another British family moved in, then the German family may have experienced to be thrown out and having to live somewhere else. So officially cohabitation of British and German families in one house was only allowed in 1951. And this was the time when building programs started. We had the same situation as in Japan, that building materials were not available directly after the war. So only in the late 40s, especially the early 50s, building programs began. And then both German houses were constructed and areas for British families, which were called married quarters.
Can I comment on the British Commonwealth situation, perhaps, because these complexes were also built, these dependence housings were also built in the British Commonwealth occupation force area in occupied Japan, and they tended to use the same design as the American homes in occupied Japan, with some modifications, like they might add a veranda or something like that to make it a little more British. But what I think is really interesting about these spaces is they weren't just houses, they were complete complexes. They were places where the occupation forces, if they chose to do so, could be self-contained. So they often had a church and a school, an entertainment area, parks. So there were these complete complexes that were built, and in the British occupation force zone, one of the biggest would be at Nijimura, near Kure. This also created an architectural barrier, I guess, a sense of an us and a them, by creating a space for the forces. and then the Japanese could usually only come in as workers to service those homes, such as domestic workers or labourers.
Just a question. Are you familiar with the neighborhood in Meijiro? It's better than most Japanese neighborhoods. Was there an American presence in Meijiro, do you know?
I don't know.
It's still there today. It's still very, the houses are probably a little bit substandard to today's standards, but by the 1950s they were top class. I'm just wondering if that was part of the American occupation or not.
Probably not. Is that if it's so, probably it's requisitioned a house rather than government ordered housing complex that fenced off area like Grand Heights, Washington Heights, and Palace Heights, and then Jefferson Heights and whatnot. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have to be careful sometimes, and my area of interest is actually Indian troops. And the Indian troops, as part of BCOF, had a very different scenario to the American troops as well as the Australian troops that were part of British Commonwealth occupation forces. In terms of the actual numbers, 1 in 3 of the occupying forces of British Commonwealth occupation forces were Indian troops, or British India, which includes Pakistanis, Indians and Bangladeshis in contemporary terms. In terms of housing, they were requisitioned, but they were requisitioned barracks. So they were in most of the cases, they were Imperial Army or Air Force barracks. So they lived in those barracks. And that in terms of families, there were very few families that were from British India. There was less than 100, maybe about 96. And they were spread across the country. They weren't necessarily just in the British Commonwealth occupation zone. Some of them were here in Tokyo. Some of them were in Okayama, where BRINDEF had its headquarters. In that case, they had requisitioned housing, but that was for officers. So when you're outside the offices, the troops lived extensively in barracks, or ex-barracks. I think it's actually also interesting, I'm just going to throw something out there, and that is that I was talking to one of the Australian troops who was here at the occupation as an Air Force, and he was talking about what happened in the earthquake in 1946. And he was saying that because they were ex-barracks and they were second floor, when the earthquake hit, a lot of them got injured jumping out of the windows on the second floor. And then there were so many fires that from then on, they actually burnt down every second building as a potential so they could have a fire break. So, you know, when we talk about occupation forces, we're talking about a very wide variety of different people, men and women, and we're talking about officers as well as troops, and we shouldn't be necessarily lumping those in together. So yeah, I mean, we can't generalize is what I'm actually saying, and there's a bit of a joke that when I talk about Indian troops, I'm always saying, but this is not the case. And that's just, I guess, another example of where we have to remember that there's a whole variety.
Yeah, and of course in Germany also most soldiers lived in barracks, as you said, and only the families they had houses. And maybe one thing which might be interesting, you both mentioned that the dependent housing areas in Japan were fenced off, or kind of fenced off. And this was not the case in Germany. It was only the case at the very beginning. So in 1945, 1946, some areas were really fenced off. All the German families who were living there had to move out if they had to come in because they worked there or worked in the garden or whatever. They needed a pass to get in. But in most cases, this was only for a few months. We don't really know how long in each case. And after that, German and British families were neighbors in many cases. And also after the construction of these so-called married quarters for British families, which also had British clubs and schools and libraries and everything the families needed, this was not fenced off. So the quarters were somehow part of the town, and local buses went through. So it was, yeah, it was accessible for everyone.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast, isn't it? I was just thinking about a particular case of a Chinese Australian woman who was part of the Australian occupation forces as a dependent, who often had trouble passing through the architectural barriers because didn't have the visual markers of being an occupier, which was, of course, aside from the British, Indian examples that you give, the main marker was being white. So this is a different case of those barriers being quite policed. Yeah. The houses that were built were usually constructed by Japanese labour or German labour in the case of occupied Germany. And then after they were built, they were usually serviced also by the occupied population. So often the only Japanese or Germans to come into many of these homes were those who were working in the homes, for instance. Something I'm very interested in, which is the domestic workers who worked in the homes. So I'm wondering maybe we talk about some of the relationships between different people in some of these spaces, whether it's barracks or whether it's the occupied homes. Because one of the really interesting things and comparisons I often make is the colonial-like nature of these homes in terms of being serviced by a number of domestic workers, whether in the case of the home, usually women, but also sometimes men, especially in the case of gardening, as you mentioned, Bettina. And as in these dependence homes, you usually see the occupier woman as being the manager of that home. So you have these really interesting gendered relationships between women in these spaces. The occupier wives enacting, in one sense, enacting power over the occupied in their home through that kind of employment as cooks and childcare workers, etc., etc. But at the same time, working together within that intimate space over time could also break down some of those barriers. So it can be, it's a kind of space where to either enact one's power over the other, to enact those barriers, but also to start to break them out, to disintegrate, to get to know each other a little bit better. Because in the home, things like fraternisation couldn't be applied in any kind of workspace. Fraternisation couldn't be applied. You needed to work together in like a supervisor-worker relationship. So I wondered if anyone has any comments about. Yeah.
I'll start out with the design of the dependent houses. In American case, we have the zillions of different styles, but the basic styles are 9 different types. And one of those types included the maze room with maze toilet, separate from occupier's bathroom and toilet. And then there's a conflicting interpretation of this design. Amino Takeo, who was involved in the designing of these American homes, argued that this was an importation of American segregated, usually it's African American maids living in white home, helping the home management and stuff. But we Japanese used to have a tradition of maid's bathroom with maid room before the World War II. So is this a continuation or discontinuation is a very interesting subject of historical inquiry. So do we have a sort of separation space between the home managers and then home helpers or not is a very interesting question to ask.
there's also segregation within the army as well.
Yes, indeed.
Black soldiers and white soldiers, prostitutes were black prostitutes and white prostitutes and things, yeah.
I'm not sure about the segregation in German houses. There were maids, also male servants living in. Most of them went to their own homes in the evening, but some went in, and so there were, even in the newly constructed houses, they had space they had rooms for domestic workers. And I spoke to some British families who lived in requisitioned houses, and they remember that they came from something like maybe a lower middle class background, and so they never had servants in Britain. And then they came to Germany, and suddenly they had double glazed windows, a fridge, and servants. And one of them commented, my mother must have thought we were living like royalty, because it was really very, very special, very, very new. And from the German point of view, I mean, these jobs were important because they were well paid, but what was more important, the servants usually got food, and they often could bring food home to their own family. So it was really a very important kind of job, and sometimes occupiers and occupied got on well with each other. Sometimes they didn't, and especially families, British families who had never had servants before, sometimes didn't know how to relate to them. So it was, everyone had to get used to this new situation. But in some cases it worked well, especially if if domestic workers were refugees from the former eastern parts of Germany, so who had no home, and their home in the requisitioned houses became their home. And in that case, sometimes a kind of friendship evolved, which lasted in some cases for decades. So the family stayed in contact. And so relations in the home were very different.
Yeah, and a very similar situation in Japan in terms of it being the kind of work where you could, again, have access to food in a time of devastation. But what you've described there, Bettina, I've often referred to as the occupiers come from those more working class backgrounds, is that they class jumped. All right, suddenly they're the middle class rather than the working class, and it happens from the other side as well, because you often have, in both cases in Japan and Germany, of women who had some, whether it was power through their husbands, or whether one example of someone I've interviewed is a Japanese woman who had a very respectable job as a teacher, but after the war had to take a job as a domestic servant in an occupier's home to be able to survive. So there's a corresponding class fall, I suppose, from the other side. So I find it really interesting the way that that occupation gets entangled with these notions of class in terms of how power is enacted. And once again, it's similar to a kind of colonial context.
I forgot where I read this, it might have been with the Korean occupation, but the occupier felt obligated to take in domestic help because of the poor situation. Do you find that, or is that in Germany or for the British or the Australian?
Well, I think they were asked to take on domestic help. I mean, it was both. It was a status symbol, of course. It was necessary maybe for the families, because in case of officers, they often went out. They had a bright social life, lots of parties and lots of meetings, lots of things. So they needed someone to look after the kids.
Yeah.
But it also, they were quite aware of the situation of the German people.
One of the interesting thing about Japanese maid employed in occupied homes is that they were employed as a quasi-national government employees, meaning that kokakome, jun kokakome. So therefore, they were protected by national law. But as soon as the occupation ended in 1952, they become a privately contracted worker in American home. And then they lost the entitlement. And they formed a union and fight against the exploitation of those American home workers, home takers. So that was an interesting legacy of the Japanese maids in American villages and American homes.
Well, that reminds me of something else, Kaz, and that is, the role of the domestic workers in the home on the one hand is to enact the power and prestige of the occupier. But the other role, and perhaps in some ways a contrasting or conflicting role, is this role of re-education in the home. So the domestic space is not just a place to enact power, it's also part of the wider re-educative role of occupation to change or to reform behaviours, and in this case, the domestic space. So, I mean, there's a very famous handbook, if we call it that, in the American case of occupied Japan, called The American Way of Housekeeping, which was meant to be a kind of text to learn how to keep house like an American woman, but the idea was also to take that out and apply it in the Japanese home as part of, I suppose, the reform of what the occupiers saw as a very patriarchal family, and the same as the case in occupied Germany. So as well as, so it has this conflicting role, I suppose, or roles in tension with each other, of on the one hand, enacting power over, but at the other hand, some sort of creating a democratic domestic space, I suppose, is one way of putting it. But that's probably a contestable term in itself. But yeah.
I'm actually just thinking about something else for a moment, and that is these people who are performing roles within the home have not necessarily been working class Japanese. They have also been people who have had servants prior to the outbreak of war, or whenever you want to consider the outbreak of war. So for many of them, being in that position requires, if you want to say, a re-education, because they've never performed those roles. So there's a different element of reclass or changing class that is being manifest in that home, and it's something that we need to explore in terms of who those people are, not only in terms of the roles that they are performing, but in terms of their own background, because we can't just assume that those people have not had servants before. And I got a funny feeling the time is becoming...
I was just going to ask, has anybody looked at how films of this era reflect the reality or aggrandize the reality, or how they reflect what was actually going on? There are a lot of films that were made in the 1940s in Japan that perhaps looked at the home.
Do they have a German case too? Did the Germans create films that reflects the
This would be the Americans or the British or
I see.
The British made films on the occupation zone, but it was more about their policy, not about people leading their private lives, people relating to each other. It was more about explaining what they wanted to do in Germany and how they did it.
This wouldn't have been the main theme of the movie, but it would show up in different, and on the point that it might be interesting to look at how the Japanese made films, how they saw it, and how an American or a British or somebody saw their domestic health would be interesting to compare.
Yeah, interesting representation question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a good question.
Time's running up, so maybe we should talk about what is going to happen after the workshop. How are we going to develop this project into a future new project?
Everyone's looking at me.
Well, I can do it.
All right.
Well, I'll start and then you
Yep.
you can finish, Rowena. So
Yep.
I think our first step is that we want to write a joint journal article together that explores 3 different spaces, 2 in Japan and 1 in Germany, to talk about how, well, not only how they were constructed and how they were used, but then the legacies of these spaces. What happened? What are the memories of these spaces? So if we use the example of Nijimura in the Beekhoff area, that was bulldozed pretty quickly in the 50s. So it's like an erasure, a deliberate erasure of the memory. You have something like Johnsontown, which has survived and has now become like a tourist zone, a little piece of I don't know, Japanized America, I suppose we could describe it. And then also to look at some of the cases in Germany where, of course, the deliberately built homes happened much later and, of course, were kept on as spaces in the post-war Cold War basis. So the journal article is one thing we want to do. Do you want to talk about, someone else want to talk about one of the other projects?
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry. The book, perhaps.
Yeah, we are planning a bigger project, a book project, comparing some of the aspects we talked about just now, about requisition spaces, about dependent housing areas, but also how people related to each other. Language might be a question. In which language did people speak to each other? Which language was used? Language as a means of enacting power, because the occupiers expected the occupied to learn the language, but the other way around, the occupied also learned the language to empower themselves. And so this might be an interesting aspect. We will also talk about work in the home, domestic violence, and again the legacy of the occupation and the legacy of the occupied spaces.
And of course, Brindif.
And Brindif.
Of course.
Sorry, I forgot about Brindif. What else did I forget?
Rowena?
As I said, there's always a but. Yeah, and I think, the book can be about language, can be about violence, but it also has to recognise, and I'm going to put a has to in there as a must, a use of language, in terms of recognising that occupiers are sometimes colonised, and the colonised are part of these occupations. And I think actually there is a really potentially interesting look at the inclusion of African Americans, or a comparison of African Americans and Brindif or the Indian troops as part of occupation, because they are in some ways segregated, or in many ways segregated within the occupiers, but they're also occupied. So I think there's potential to look at something like that down the track.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, Rowena, and there's a perception of the occupying forces in these cases of being very white, but one really important example in the Australian, I've mentioned the Chinese-Australian War, and there were Chinese Australians involved, but there were also Indigenous Australians, and that's another example of a former colonised.
There's also Japanese Americans.
And Japanese
as well.
Americans in the American forces. So the if you want to call it the race aspect is something that also needs to be teased out, along with the kind kinds of
And I just want to
class examples that we've talked
I just want to
about.
throw one more grenade, is what I usually say, and that is that we need to also consider the fact that the occupiers are not just army, they're actually air forces. And the Air Force has a far greater ability to be integrated and to respect each other for some reason I can't tell you than the Army has. In terms, you know, I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm just saying that there are that sort of separation
There is, yeah.
is actually a very important one. And in terms of the Allied occupation, there does tend to be not only this focus on the Americans, but also a focus on the Army. And that is not necessarily one that recognises the full extent of what the occupation was included.
Thank you, Rowena. Mark?
No, I just mentioned, I compare Korea, and Korea had a terrible occupation compared to Japan. It was occupied, whereas Japan had a government. MacArthur was the head of the government, and I reasoned it to be that the American occupation was more of a reunion of people who had been in Japan. The war happened. Joseph Greuze said, if you clear out the bad branches, you'll get a good government, and that's actually what happened. Whereas in Korea, they didn't find the branches. Everybody was bad. Is one point. The other point is you're leaving out that the Soviets were left out of the occupation. They were supposed to be included, but at the last minute Truman said, no way, we don't want any commies here. And so they were shut out of Hokkaido, which is where they were supposed to be. And I'm just reading about that in the Korean War, I think. The third point is with India, it's more of a question, but how does India assumed some very important positions after the war. As a colonist, yeah, there were the judge and the tribunal. There was with Korea, they were on committees. And what was going on with India? Why did they get such a privileged position?
I can't answer that question, but I do want to say here that I have been leaving out the Gurkhas. When I talk about Brindif, and we talk about India, we also should recognise that there were Gurkhas, and Gurkhas, of course, are a totally different group of structurally as well as politically, and they were separate.
Yeah.
India had been moving towards independence and had been assuming some, moving towards assuming the roles of independence. So that sort of came into it. But of course, troops from India were very, very involved in the troops fights, battles against the Japanese in Burma and places like that, and that was part of recognition of their assistance in that at the end of the Second World War.
The other point is that you mentioned food. Where did the food come from? Was it all shipped in from the States or other places? Occupiers were eating good, but Japanese were starving. And the last point I want to make is the language, the importance of English. I've done some reading on Japanese working in the military bases, and they didn't have to speak Harvard English. They could just speak some broken English and they'd get a job. And then they were sent to Korea as translators. I don't know what they translated for, but they were translating and different jobs, cooks and things like that, just because they could speak broken English. So the importance of English, sorry to say, that our students are still struggling to this day because they have to study 6 years things or 7 years of English. It's all because of the occupation.
Yeah, I just wish to say something. As you mentioned, the Indian and Gurkha forces in Japan, I just wish to add that in Germany there were only British troops, as far as I know. We didn't have British or Gurkha troops in the occupation of Germany, although they shipped all the troops around the world all the time.
Yeah.
And this is something which I find very interesting, and I don't really know. I suppose it was purpose not to bring them in, but I'm not sure about it, and I don't really know why. But this is something we would have to look into. Yeah.
Maybe race?
Well,
I think, yeah, because German villages still remains, because German house, I'm assuming German houses look more like American houses, whereas they really stood out in Japan as, you know, this is elite, and I could see them getting rid of them more quickly than German, just because of the race factor.
yeah. So some interesting question to
Yeah, yeah.
look into.
To explore.
Yeah.
And
Thank you so
Japanese
much.
don't like used houses either, that's the other thing.
Thank you so much. The time's up, and then I'd like to close out today's roundtable discussion with, again, thanks to the DFG. Back in 2019, we hosted a DFG Leipzig lecture here, and that was the beginning of collaboration, international collaboration. It evolved into such a big, important project, and I thank you again for DFG, and thank you for the Institute for hosting this workshop. Thank you so much. Thank you.